Okay, it's just a little bit after 10. Welcome everybody to what I think is going to be a fantastic panel on green infrastructure and the evolution of building resilient infrastructure in communities. We've got a fantastic panel. I'm your moderator. My name is Gavin Smith. I'm a professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning at North Carolina State University. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the great qualifications of the speakers, nor am I going to speak much myself, but rather really want to jump right into the dialogue, and I'll introduce each speaker briefly, but also want to let people know this session is a little different than some of the others in that it's really meant for Camille to talk through, which is an exciting program that's evolving, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program. And a series of speakers will talk to some of the work they're doing, and then we'll have a dialogue amongst Camille and the panelists. So that'll be the primary function, but if you do enter questions in the chat, we may get to some of those. It really depends on how the discussion goes. So I think this is a great opportunity to share information about the program, but also looking at this program from multiple perspectives, federal agencies, universities, those that have actually written BRIC applications. So I think this is a great opportunity to share information. So for those of you that don't know, Camille Crain will be leading us off. She is the BRIC section chief from Fema, and she's going to be speaking for 30 minutes. And then we're going to have the remainder of the panelists each speak for 15 minutes, including Heidi Stiller from the South, who is the South Regional Director at the NOAA Office of Coastal Management, Rod Braun, the Manager of Climate and Coastal Resilience Program at the Nature Conservancy, Danielle Irwin, who's the Director of the Cummins and Cedarburg Coastal and Marine Engineering Program, and Andy Fox, who is a professor at North Carolina State University. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Camille to let her speak to you about this program, and then we'll follow it up with the remaining panelists. Welcome, Camille.
Thank you so much, Gavin, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak on this panel. When you showed me your idea for the title, it really got me excited. When we talk about the evolution of BRIC, that is a for real thing. We are about 2 years and 3 months into the passage of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, and we are a mere 2 days away from getting our first years of BRIC applications. And our team is so excited to see, after 2 years of planning this program and working on the design and talking to people about it, seeing what those first crop of applications actually are. So I'm excited to come here today and be on this panel. So without further ado, what I'm going to talk about today is, as it relates to nature-based solutions, a couple things that are going on inside of FEMA that are resources that support nature-based solutions. I'm going to start with that before I go into a BRIC specific discussion. They're larger than BRIC. They serve in other kinds of ways, but they actually absolutely support the BRIC program. I'm then going to talk about some details of the BRIC program, and without going into too many specifics about this first year, because we are 2 days away from the application period closing. But I want to give you a sense of what that program is, or what our program is, what we hope to do with it, and how we see it moving forward, and then leave you with a few examples of projects that we think incorporate nature-based solutions that would be eligible in the BRIC program. So with that, next slide, please. So let me just start with a base of what we mean in the BRIC program when we say we have a priority for nature-based solutions. So you're going to see on there a definition of how we are defining nature-based solutions in our program. And you'll see this also in our materials that we put out, because as I get to later talking about BRIC, we have a competition. And so when we talk about awarding points, this is what we're talking about: sustainable environmental management practices that restore, mimic, and or enhance nature and natural systems and processes. And this is key for us at FEMA, support natural hazard risk reduction or risk mitigation. So these practices will help reduce the risk to a natural hazard, whether it's hurricane or flood or earthquake, wildfire, whatever it might be. At the same time, we like ancillary or co-benefits, so it can also we encourage the support of other efforts as it relates to economic benefits, environmental and social resiliency benefits. But our primary benefit, you'll hear me talk about this later, is natural hazard risk reduction. Some examples of this are restoration of grasslands, rivers and floodplains, wetlands, dunes, and reefs, living shorelines, soil stabilization, bioretention systems. There is a plethora of different techniques that can be used in as a nature-based solution. And projects can have pieces of nature-based in them, or they can be in total a nature-based project. So going to the next slide, I want to go into one of those resources that I mentioned that we have at FEMA. So our partners in another area of FEMA, which is where we sit in FEMA, which is the Risk Management Directorate, or RMD, created this summer a guide. And this was something we absolutely want to promote with the BRIC program, this guide that they've created, called the Building Community Resilience with Nature-Based Solutions, a guide for local communities. As not a nature-based solutions expert myself, I learned a lot from this guide. It gave me very practical, as a practitioner, examples of what different nature-based solutions are, what different techniques, how you could partner, how you should think about it when you're developing your community. RMD put this guide together with great support from NOAA. So I'm very happy to be sitting on a panel today with Heidi. NOAA has been a fantastic partner with us at FEMA and inside the BRIC program. But this is something that they helped us put together. There's a link there of where you can download a copy of this guide, but I think it is really a great primer if you want to know more about nature-based solutions. Next slide. So another piece that I really want to talk to before I go into the BRIC program is our updated ecosystem service benefits policy. So as I looked across, Gavin talked to me about, what kind of policy updates do you have that really support nature-based solutions? And this is our primary one. As our projects all have to be shown, our mitigation projects have to be shown to be cost effective. That's typically done through a benefit cost analysis, or BCA, process. And we have a software that does that. And so this is a policy that came out in September, or I should say was updated in September, that we hope will help projects that have nature-based components be shown to be cost effective, or have an easier path to being shown to be cost effective. So if you can go to the next slide. You'll see there a copy of the policy on the right and a link to it, just to give you kind of a background on this policy. It was actually started in 2013. Originally, when the policy came out, it said, okay, this policy it only can be used for acquisition or buyout or open space projects, and you have to achieve at least a 0.75 in your benefit cost ratio before you can apply this eco service benefits to it. So basically saying your benefit cost ratio to be shown as cost effective to make you eligible has to be at least a 1.0. You would have to achieve other benefits through natural hazard risk reduction of up to a 0.75, and then you could add, if you had that, these eco service benefits, or ecosystem service benefits, excuse me. In 2016, we updated the policy to make it available for any project type. It didn't have to be restricted just to our acquisition or buyout projects. What we think is game changing of what we did in 2020 in September to support all of our hazard mitigation assistance programs, including the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program and the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program and BRIC, is we removed the 0.75 threshold. So you do not, while we still say our risk reduction primary benefits have to be from natural hazard risk reduction, you don't have to get to a 0.75 before you can add these ecosystem service benefits. So it gives a lower threshold to add these benefits in to try to achieve that 1.0 for cost effectiveness. So the next slide kind of gives the purpose of why we've done it. As I said, easier inclusion of nature-based solutions, recognizing the role of the natural environment has in a community's resiliency strategy, and it aligns with other BCA guidance on benefits. So as you look across the other benefits you can count in the benefit cost analysis, we didn't have thresholds for any of the other benefits. You didn't have to achieve a certain number before you could apply those. So we thought, why are we doing it for the ecosystem service benefits if we don't do it for the other benefits? We wanted to, like I said, ease access, reduce complexity is one of the primary goals of FEMA. If you look at FEMA's strategic plan, goal number 3 is reduce complexity, and we were hoping this does that. So next slide. Let me talk a little bit about the BRIC program, Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. As I said, this program came about through the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018. We spent a year and a half developing it, and I would say getting it approved, and actually at 2 years to get it all the way through the cycle so that we could open up our first application period at the end of September. So right before the 2nd anniversary, we actually launched the program. But going back in history to give you kind of the evolution steps. Next slide, please. So one thing we did is we understood the opportunity we had been given with this program and how that doesn't come about every day. And so we wanted to act with a lot of intention in how we built it. From October 5th of 2018 up through the summer of 2019, we were doing stakeholder engagement and research. We ended up in the summer of 2019 doing a nationwide request for information, basically. What do you think about our current programs? What would you like to see in this new program? We did it through webinars, emails, letters. We ended up with over 5,000 individual non-attributable comments and more than 70 agency letters in support of the BRIC program and saying, here's our challenges with your current program, here's our challenges with other programs, here's what we would like to see, here's what we need. We took that and worked with leadership to develop our 6 guiding principles. So this is summer of 2019, and that's what you're going to see there on the left. These are, once we started building out the mechanics and the design of the program, we built those on the foundation of these 6 principles. So we wanted to support community capacity and capability building. You'll see in the name of our program, it's building resilient infrastructure and communities. We saw this in our stakeholder feedback, the need for technical assistance, the need to help communities build capacity and capability. So this is something we have built into our program in different project types that we can fund and in some of the competition criteria of how we award points. That is what we see as our primary goals, is to build that capacity. We want to encourage and enable innovation. We've been doing mitigation projects for 30+ years with FEMA, but we want to encourage communities to think differently. We support our traditional project types, but we don't want to shortchange or cut out anybody who wants to try new things. This one sometimes makes people nervous. They think, well, what if I can't be innovative? I've had that conversation with some communities. And what I want to stress too is we want to meet communities where they are. How are they being innovative within themselves? And this could be in a project type. This could be in a way you're doing partnerships. This could be in a way you are administering the grant. But how are you pushing, or how are you being innovative for yourself? We want to promote partnerships, and this is something we have throughout the program and the design. We understand that while we think BRIC is great, one program can't solve all the needs as it relates to the current condition of infrastructure, the current resiliency needs to natural hazards, and particularly as we move into the future, looking at the future conditions, it's going to take more than one program. It's going to take the whole community. So we wanted to have elements of our program that support and encourage innovation. We're hoping that we could potentially be seed money in some ways for other dollars being spent. We're hoping that we can build networks of folks that can support each other at the community level. So we think promoting, we're very strong right now, or very intentional, I should say, on promoting partnerships. We wanted to enable large infrastructure projects. The program we replaced, the pre-disaster PDM program, had a cap of $10 million per project. We increased that for this first year of BRIC to $50 million per project. We wanted to be able to fund these larger projects. We wanted to maintain flexibility. We are very serious about it being a program that continuously improves, that be a program that is responsive to stakeholder feedback, that is a program that is responsive or proactive to what the needs in the country are. So we have purposely built mechanics into our foundational documents that allow us to change over time as needed or as advised. And then we want to provide consistency at the same time. As I talked about a minute ago, we are one of 3 hazard mitigation assistance grant programs that exist at FEMA. And in our applicants, so our state and tribal and territorial partners, a lot of the folks that manage the hazard mitigation grant, flood mitigation assistance program will also be managing BRIC. So where we could align with those 2 programs on some of their best elements, we've done so. And then we also were very thoughtful to the FEMA strategic plan when we were building out the program. The strategic plan, if you're a long-term mitigator like me, of 20 plus years working in mitigation in the grant programs, it is very focused on mitigation and resiliency. The number 1 goal, or the first goal I should say, in FEMA's current strategic plan is building a culture of preparedness. And within that, it talks about increasing the mitigation investment. And that is something that we are key in. The second one is readying the nation for catastrophic disasters. As part of that, we are looking at supporting community lifelines and those critical needs in a community to help hopefully reduce the impact or eliminate the impact when a catastrophic disaster comes. And then the third is reducing the complexity of FEMA. So we try to be thoughtful in our design, that we were not making something so complex that people could not use our grant program, which wouldn't be good for any of us. The next slide, please. As you look at our notice of funding opportunity for this first year of BRIC, you're going to see 4 priorities for funding. The priorities for funding for BRIC in our program: encouraging public infrastructure projects. That's infrastructure that protects the public, may not be owned by the public, although only public entities are eligible applicants, which I'll talk about in a second. The second is increasing projects that reduce the risk to 1 or more community lifelines. FEMA's community lifeline construct came about in 2017 as a response to the hurricane season. It is a way it talks about the critical services that a community has, and how it first started is how to report the status of those services and making sure those services, could come back online. We, in mitigation, thought about that and thought, well, if we mitigate the risk to those services, maybe we can recover faster. Goals. So that is something we are focused on as well, is supporting the mitigation of the risk of those community lifelines. We wanted to promote projects that incorporate nature-based solutions. And then fourth, incentivize the adoption and enforcement of modern building codes. If you look throughout the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, you're going to see lots of language that support building codes. That is one of the keys of our program, and you're going to see that come through in the program design in a few different ways. Next slide. So this is what I lovingly call our pizza tracker. And we needed, I joined FEMA headquarters as the BRIC section lead 1 year after Disaster Recovery Reform Act, so in October of 2019. And the number 1 thing I saw when I joined was people were like, where's the program? We need to put some information out. So we created a pizza tracker on our website so people at least could at a high level see where we were in the development, because we knew we had a lot of interest, blessed with a lot of interest about our program. So we were very excited when we got to move our red arrow to the right on September 29th of 2020, when we actually opened our first application period. As I said, we are checking the calendar 2 days away from the close of that period. So we're interested to see what kind of applications we get in. We will start the review, and I should say the project selection is slated that I apologize, the slide says spring 2001, but it's actually summer of 2001. We have a robust review period where we want to involve other federal agencies and state, local, tribal, and territorial, so we can get really a good review and a lot of partners involved in the process, and we anticipate that will take throughout the spring. So looking at project selection in summer of 2021, and then this is the year one timeline. At the same time, we'll be rolling out year two of the program probably in August of 2021. So about the time we're making selections for year one, it'll be putting year two on the street for applications development. Next slide. So I mentioned a minute ago who's eligible. And this is always something I want to include because I know, we, like we said, we've been blessed with a lot of support in the program, but we need to be very clear on who can actually apply to the grants. So when we talk about our applicants, those are folks that can apply directly to FEMA. That includes all 50 states, the U.S. territories, the District of Columbia, and federally recognized tribes. They are the applicants to FEMA in the BRIC program. These sub-applicants, that means entities that can apply to an applicant who then forward their applications to FEMA, include local governments, tribal governments, different state agencies, and different tribal agencies. So for example, if a state division of water or natural resources wanted to apply for a grant, they would apply as a sub-applicant traditionally to the state's emergency management office. If a county wanted to apply for a project, they would apply as a sub-applicant to the state emergency management office, who then applies to FEMA. What you won't see on this list is private citizens, nonprofit, private industry, but they absolutely can benefit from mitigation projects. While they can't apply directly, they can apply through one of their sub-applicants who then can submit their application to the state, who submits it to FEMA. Traditionally, most of our projects benefit private citizens, might be through acquisitions, elevations, could be on downtown sectors that have businesses. But we absolutely they can benefit, they just can't apply directly. They have to be supported by one of these entities. Next slide. One of the first questions I always get is, well, what's eligible? Or I've applied for this in the past, is it still eligible? So the base answer is yes. If it was eligible before, it's still eligible for BRIC. You're going to see in the middle there a copy of our hazard mitigation assistance guidance. It's from 2015. It is the current latest version. Inside of it, it has a checklist that includes a laundry list of all these different project types. And so if it was eligible before under the pre-disaster mitigation or PDM program, it is still eligible. In addition, we've added new project types as it relates to building codes, funding those activities, partnerships. And we have a couple that came to us through the DRA, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, as far as Section 1205 for wildfire and wind, and Section 1233 for early earthquake warning. So we've added some new in addition to all the ones. I always like to say, because we encourage innovation, that at the end of the day, a project must be the things that are in that blue box to the right. A project has to be shown to be cost effective. It has to have that reduction or elimination of risk and damages from future natural hazards. Like I said, we like co-benefits or ancillary benefits, but that primary benefit has to be natural hazard risk reduction. If there's a building component to it, it must be designed and built to one of the latest 2 consensus code for whatever that applicable code is for that project type. For example, if it's building, that would currently be the 2015 or 2018 International Building Code. It must align with both applicant and sub-applicant hazard mitigation plans, and it must meet all environmental and historic preservation requirements. Next slide. So looking to see how nature-based solutions fits into the program, our competition, so our program is divided basically into 3 different funding mechanisms. You have a $600,000 allocation to the states, or I should say, sorry, to the states and territories and the District of Columbia, where they can apply for different project types. Then you've got a $20 million set aside for our federally recognized tribes. And the balance, which for this year is $500 million, so the balance is $446 million, goes into a national competition for mitigation projects. All those will be scored on a point system. So our points are divided into, it's 200 points total. There's 100 points for technical and 100 points for qualitative. Technical are binary. You either get all the points or 0 the points, and they really speak to the priorities of the program. So you're going to see in there's a red box around. We're giving 10 points for the incorporation of nature-based solutions into the project design. You'll see there across the 4 priorities I spoke to earlier: infrastructure, lifelines, nature-based solutions, and building codes. Across those 4, that which ends up being 5, because it's everything on the top line and the first one on the second line, that represents those priorities 80 points in our technical criteria. These will be scored as part of our first kind of tranche of going through our applications when we do what are called eligibility and completeness. We make sure the projects are eligible, make sure they're complete, and we score them across this 100. We will take, our NOFO says, we have a $500 million program value. We will take $1 billion of applications, so twice the value, across to our qualitative. So if you go to the next slide. We have 6 criteria for our qualitative. Qualitative being that these are going to be scored not by FEMA staff, but by our SLTT partners in panels, as well as other federal agencies, state, locals, tribes, and territories, as well as other federal agencies. These are also gradients, so it's not an all or nothing. You can get somewhere between, like for example, the risk reduction of 0 and 35 points. These are also speak to priorities of the program. Where you'll see nature-based solutions hopefully come out is talks about this risk reduction. One of the things, or a couple things we talk about as talking about how you demonstrate risk reduction. That includes a discussion of ancillary benefits. It includes a discussion of innovation. So you'll see opportunities to put nature-based in your description of your project to achieve more risk reduction points, as well as you look at the 15 points for future conditions. We see that nature-based solutions could absolutely help in solving against future conditions as well. You'll also see their implementation measures to just determine how do you have a sound plan for how the project will be managed and implemented, populations impacted, looking at the percentage of the community that's been included, outreach activities, and then of course leveraging partners, which we talked about is one of our guiding principles. Next slide. Just to give a run through quickly a few different examples of different projects. None of these, of course, are BRIC funded, as we're just now getting our first crop of applications, but some of these have received funding from FEMA, including this underground resiliency park in Hoboken, New Jersey. So this is an example of a project that was funded through our PDM, or pre-disaster mitigation program. $50 million project type, only received $10 million from PDM because that's the cap. So we like it for the partnership. They had a really big non-federal cost share on this one. But it is a nature-based solution in a very urban area. What you end up here with is you had massive flooding. So what they're building is a underground ability to basically retention and then get out water basically. And what they built on top of it was a green park that not only provides basically social benefits, and it provides a green space inside of this community. And this is currently in construction with an anticipated completion date in the fall of 2022. Going to a second example on the next slide. This is the Resilient St. Vrain project in Longmont, Colorado. So this is a creek that was deteriorating and severely flooding the surrounding area. And so they've started a project that is going to be completed in phases. It has a variety of projects, including some FEMA dollars in it. It's anticipated to end up costing between $120, $140 million. But basically, they're looking to restore the flood damaged greenway, at the same time adding functionality like bike paths, fields, and trees. They're looking to stabilize the creek banks to protect trails, access roads, and infrastructure from further creek damage, and helping to reestablish vegetation and wetlands habitats for fish and wildlife. So using a variety of nature-based solutions to create lots of different benefits across both habitat and natural hazard risk reduction and societal as well. And the next example. This is one that doesn't have any FEMA funding in it, but it's something we wanted to really highlight, and that's the Exploration Green Stormwater Park in Houston, Texas. This also is another one that is currently under construction, being completed in phases. It was started before Hurricane Harvey in 2017, and with the work they have done was credited with basically reducing flood damages from about 150 homes. But when it's completed, and basically what it is it is a former golf course that is being redeveloped into a series of detention basins with a drainage ditch. It is going to include residential, recreational facilities, multi-use paths, visitor center, practice fields. It is expected that when it's completed, it's going to be able to protect or have flood reduction for 30,000 people that live within a half mile of the park. Slated about cost of about $38 million, completed in 2022. And next slide. What I want to leave you with here is just a list of, I've talked a little bit to give you a very quick highlight of what the BRIC program is. As I talked about, we are very much nearing the end of our application period, but we want to, we also know that to develop some of these projects, you can't do it within 4 months. So we already are encouraging people to start thinking about their projects they might be submitting for year 2, so next fall. Here are some different resources. We tried to create a lot of different resources about some of the new things we're doing in the BRIC program to help people. If you couldn't attend a webinar, you need more information. So you're going to see on there our BRIC website, which is, you can find all these materials at www.fema.gov/BRIC, so BRIC. We tried to make that easy. We have what we call program support material. So we've created those for our technical and our qualitative criteria, so those competition criteria. We've created them for some of the new project types we have, like building codes, partnerships, project scoping, and some of this and the support we're doing for mitigation planning. We also in our program have something called, I'm really proud of, our non-financial direct technical assistance. And so it has the same due date as our applications in 2 days. But it is meant for communities that don't have the capacity or capability to complete one of our grant applications, but they definitely have need. And so it is an expression of interest that you basically write in a letter. There's no required format, and it's submitted to an email box through an eligible applicant. So like a community would submit to their state, and the state can submit on their behalf. For FEMA or one of its partners to come in and offer non-financial direct technical assistance to help achieve a mitigation or resiliency outcome. It is meant to, what we're hoping is we can do 10 communities this first year, and this is something we'll grow over years and really start to create that peer network. We're really proud of this element of our program and hope that we get a lot of interest in it. Another thing I really want to highlight on this list is what we call the Mitigation Action Portfolio, or MAP. This is something that came as a direct request through the stakeholder feedback we did in summer of 2019. It is a living document that is a collection currently of about 42 case studies that just give a quick 2-page on different project types. We got a lot of questions about, well, what do you mean by a BRIC project, or what do you mean by a project that has nature-based solutions in it? So we created a portfolio of different projects that cover across the country, different sizes of communities, different hazards, small projects, large projects, but could give a flavor. So hopefully anyone in the country that looks at it will see something that is needed in their community. It is, when I say living, a document we are taking, we have on our website, we have a template case study form that people can submit their case studies, and if we find that they would be eligible, we can include them, and we look at updating the mitigation action portfolio about twice a year. You'll also see on the right just a laundry list of things or places where you can go to get help. FEMA Go is our application system, BCA helpline, other helplines listed there as well. So if you are completing a BRIC application and you need assistance, these are places you can reach out for. So with that, next slide is my final one. Thank you so much for your time. Gavin, I'll turn it over to you for the next panel.
Great, thank you so much, Camille. So what we're going to do now is we're going to jump right into our next speaker, and then we'll ask a series of questions. But Heidi Stiller, she's already pulled up and ready to go. So thanks, Heidi. Welcome.
Thanks, Gavin. Appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to be participating in the Partnerships virtual conference today, although I do wish we were all in person. But it's also great to be presenting alongside other folks who are passionate about green infrastructure or nature-based solutions. I'll use those two terms interchangeably today. So green infrastructure has really caught the attention of local governments that are looking to handle growing stormwater management challenges. It's also caught the attention of federal agencies like the Army Corps and Department of Transportation that are looking to protect their built infrastructure. And it's also caught the attention of insurers and reinsurers who are realizing the mitigation potential. And as we just heard from Camille, of course, FEMA is really emphasizing nature-based solutions in their rollout of the BRIC funding opportunity. So just a lot of interest in the topic. Today, I want to share some of NOAA's green infrastructure resources, and I really emphasize the training, tools, and data that we have available that can support communities as they're pursuing green infrastructure and potentially applying to BRIC. I'll also touch briefly on ways that NOAA contributes to funding green infrastructure directly. Just a quick note about the photo on this slide here. So in addition to trying to help our partners, NOAA also looks for opportunities to apply nature-based solutions at our own sites. This is a NOAA lab in Beaufort, North Carolina. And in the foreground, you see a big living shoreline project that protects a stretch of coast that was eroding. Next slide, please. All right, so today I'll just touch very briefly on my office and about our Digital Coast Initiative, but really then focus in on the training, tools, and data that we have to share with folks that are working on green infrastructure. And then a little bit at the end just on how NOAA and some of our partners will fund green infrastructure or provide technical assistance, and then a closing note about how communities can and are pursuing green infrastructure. Next slide, please. So NOAA, as I'm sure many of you know, our mission is all about science, service, and stewardship. And for my office, we're really guided by pursuing healthy and resilient communities, ecosystems, and economies. And some of you may be wondering sort of, what is coastal management? Coastal management is all about those decisions and actions that we take to keep the natural environment, built environment, quality of life, and economic prosperity in balance in our coastal areas. Next slide, please. Partnerships are really key to everything that my office does. Our partners are diverse, including state agencies, local governments, private sector, professional associations, academia, other federal agencies. And for time reasons, I won't go into detail about all 4 of these programs here, but these are the 4 major partnership programs that make up the Office for Coastal Management. Next slide, please. So I hope that many of you online today are already familiar with the Digital Coast, and I suspect you are, but I'll just briefly mention the platform and the partnership. For over a decade now, NOAA has been working with other organizations who have memberships involved in coastal management, like the American Planning Association, like the Association of State Floodplain Managers, like the Nature Conservancy. And together we have built the Digital Coast, and it's really intended to be a one-stop shop where coastal decision makers can find data, tools, training, tutorials, case studies relevant to the issues that they face. And the platform is really built on the interactions between the partners and the users. So as we hear needs on the ground, we work to serve up resources on Digital Coast that address those needs. So not surprisingly, there are a lot of resilience and green infrastructure related resources on Digital Coast. Next slide, please. So this graphic is one of the things that you can grab from Digital Coast and use if you'd like to use it in your own outreach. But the graphic is intended to show the breadth of coastal natural infrastructure. all the different ways and types that it can be applied. In NOAA, we work in this space in a variety of ways. NOAA does do research to better understand the services that we get from green infrastructure, including the coastal hazard impact reduction services. We also develop products and tools to help our partnerships plan for natural infrastructure. And then we directly support conservation, restoration efforts that create natural infrastructure. And finally, we do educate the public on the multiple benefits. Next slide, please. On the digital coast, if you search for natural infrastructure, you'll find a topics page. I've got the link there at the bottom that's devoted to this issue. And here you can find examples of projects, training, information about the benefits, and visualizations that you can use in your own communication efforts. Next slide, please. So one of our trainings is nature-based solutions for coastal hazards. And this training was really designed to help coastal decision makers plan for and implement natural infrastructure projects that will mitigate hazards in their communities. And I'm pretty sure that some of you on the line today have actually already hosted this course, so you're very familiar. But it starts out with an online module that really covers sort of foundational concepts about green infrastructure. And then there's an in-person one-day workshop. And the idea with that workshop is to really bring in folks from a community so that they can interact together and meet local experts and start to develop a green infrastructure strategy. During the pandemic, we have transitioned this workshop to an online format, so it's still available if you're interested in having it sooner rather than later. After the course, participants can describe natural infrastructure practices, and they can think about considerations for choosing techniques. So they think about hazard reduction benefits, ecosystem service co-benefits, design, maintenance, costs, partnerships, funding, you name it. The course really tries to get folks ready to move towards implementation. Next slide. This resource, the Green Infrastructure Mapping Guide, is targeted at a technical audience. It helps spatial analysts that work with GIS to map areas that will meet conservation goals as well as hazard resilience goals such as flood storage or erosion control. Next slide, please. So this resource is something that we built in direct response to needs we were hearing on the ground. So a lot of partners told us they really need to understand which techniques work best to reduce specific hazard impacts. So we developed this database of the literature, and it's got data and literature specifically focused on effectiveness. And you can filter using region, scale, the hazard of interest, or by natural infrastructure types. And there's 32 different types to choose from in this database. Next slide, please. So one of the reasons that green infrastructure is being explored by more and more folks is because of the multiple benefits. In addition to mitigating coastal hazards, nature-based solutions can also provide ecosystem services such as improving water quality, providing critical habitat, and supporting recreational opportunities like that park that Camille was telling us about as one of the great examples. But communities also need to understand how much it costs to implement these projects, and they need help understanding how to quantify both the costs and the benefits. So they can make the case, right, to elected officials and to the public, and so they can complete the cost benefit analyses that are required for BRIC and other funding programs. So this is an area where we have started to focus, and we really want to do more. On Digital Coast, we've already got several resources on the benefits and costs. There's a 2-pager that will help with communicating with local officials broadly about the benefits of green infrastructure for reducing climate and hazard impacts. And then there's a more detailed 4-pager that has information on different green infrastructure types and hazard mitigation benefits, as well as other co-benefits. We also have a table that you can pull down and print that summarizes information from the literature on installation and maintenance costs for different types, if you just want to get a ballpark about what these things cost. And then finally, there's a 3-pager for non-economists that walks through the different approaches for assessing the costs and benefits of green infrastructure and when to use them. So it explains about when you might want to do a cost benefit analysis, a cost effectiveness analysis, or a qualitative assessment. And also, I want to mention we have some new trainings that are in development right now. The first will be launching next month, and it'll be a quarterly webinar, and it's called Economic Guidance for Coastal Management Professionals. And it'll really be the basics, right, of how economic analysis works for projects such as natural infrastructure projects. The second will launch in March of this year, so also pretty soon, and it's going to be an e-learning tool called Economic Valuation Analysis for Decision Makers. And it's really going to provide a step-by-step process. It'll identify data resources to help you estimate ecosystem goods and services, and it will include examples. And along with that, we also do have several economists on staff in Office for Coastal Management, and they're always available to provide technical assistance for specific questions. And then a third training that's also coming, probably not till summer though, is about how to use benefits transfer methodology to estimate ecosystem service valuation. So stay tuned for all of those things. Keep an eye on Digital Coast. Next slide, please. We also have visualization tools, and I wanted to mention two of our most popular resilience-related tools, and really note that both of these can help with considering future conditions, excuse me, because they have sea level rise data in them. Camille mentioned that future conditions is one of the things that they'll be looking at in BRIC projects. So one of these tools is the Coastal Flood Exposure Mapper. You're seeing just a screen grab of this. Next slide, please. The mapper allows you to find your geography. You can zoom into your community or zoom into a neighborhood. What you're seeing right here is Charleston, South Carolina. A lot of you will recognize the peninsula there. And then you can visualize various coastal hazards. We've got high tide flooding, FEMA flood zone, tsunami zones, storm surge, and sea level rise layers in here. And then you can overlay that inundation hazard information with societal data or infrastructure information or ecosystem maps. And that's what you see here. These can be used to assess vulnerability, but also to consider where existing or restored natural infrastructure can provide protection. So this map shows ecosystem types in different colors and development in grayscale, and then it's overlaid with that high tide flooding. So this is those king tide type events that are occurring more and more frequently. And it helps us see where existing natural areas already provide protection and where additional natural infrastructure might be deployed. And the great thing about this tool is that any map you make, you can click with a button and save it, and then you can go back and you can print it out to bring to a meeting, or you can email the link to a colleague. It's super user-friendly. This is a tool that I can use myself, even though I'm not a GIS whiz kid. I used it to make a map to give to my realtor when I was hunting for a house to make sure I wasn't going to be in a flood zone now or anytime in the near future. So super easy to use. Next slide, please. The other visualization tool I mentioned is our sea level rise viewer. Many folks on the line today, I'm sure, have seen this tool because it gets a lot of use. Some of you have probably even pulled the underlying data for your own tools and vulnerability assessments. It allows users to visualize sea level rise up to 10 feet. And the tool also builds in the scenarios from the National Climate Assessment. And so you can look at what the scenarios say for your community. This is just a screen grab of the launch page, and from here you can open the tool, but you can also see a tutorial, download the underlying data, see related trainings, or read stories about how others have used the viewer. Next slide, please. So speaking of stories, I do want to mention that we have a host of stories from the field, we call them, on Digital Coast. Many of these are related to green infrastructure and hazard resilience. So you can check those out to see what other communities are trying. And if you've used a Digital Coast resource and have a good story, please do reach out. We're always adding to this collection of stories because we know that peer-to-peer learning is one of the most valuable things. Next slide. I'm going to switch gears just a little bit and talk about how NOAA does provide some funding and technical assistance along with the data, tools, and training that we've been discussing. So NOAA's community-based restoration program provides technical and financial assistance for restoration projects that help recover and sustain fisheries. And while the focus is on habitat benefits, these projects, of course, can also provide hazard resilience benefits, such as restoring wetlands, right, that also can help with flood storage. There were $4 million in grants for this program in 2020. I want to mention the Sea Grant programs. We probably have a number of Sea Grant reps on the line this morning. The Sea Grant programs are a great resource. They conduct research on nature-based solutions, and they help communities with their planning processes and building in green infrastructure during those discussions. Some of the state coastal zone management programs may have funding to support projects. We heard a little bit about that yesterday from a number of folks. And they also can help with dialogue, technical assistance, and convening around green infrastructure. The Coral Reef Conservation Program, which is one of our initiatives, has several funding opportunities that can support reef conservation and restoration. And we know these reefs provide tremendous protection for coastal areas. In recent years, the National Estuarine Research Reserves, again, we may have some folks on the reserves on the line today, but they've been doing a lot of research about the effectiveness, impacts, methods around living shorelines and other types of green infrastructure. And this research has been supporting state policy development as well. Finally, the National Coastal Resilience Fund is a NOAA partnership with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And this one I'll give a little bit more detail on in the next slide, please. So NIFWIF and NOAA administer the National Coastal Resilience Fund. This year will be the program's 4th year. And the whole idea is to restore, increase, strengthen natural infrastructure that protects coastal communities while also enhancing habitat for fish and wildlife. So really looking at those dual benefits. In FY20, Congress appropriated $33 million for the program. And we're happy to share that in 21, there will be $34 million for this program, and the RFP for that will be out in spring. Next slide, please. The National Coastal Resilience Fund has already supported projects in all the states and territories in the Southeastern Caribbean region. I picked just a handful to put on this slide to give you an idea of the types of projects. But projects can include, shovel-ready, in-the-dirt restoration type work. But there's also categories for engineering and design. And starting last year, there's a new category for planning and capacity building. So communities that want to do green infrastructure, but really need to come up with their plan before they're ready to start doing their projects. There is some funding for that as well now. I'll be sure to share the 2021 RFP for this with the SCDRP email list when it comes out, probably in March. Next slide. As my final topic today, I just want to touch on how municipal actions can foster implementation of green infrastructure. Community planning efforts are really essential in getting green infrastructure projects off the ground. Some communities have gone with standalone green infrastructure plans, but in many cases, a successful strategy is to incorporate green infrastructure or nature-based solutions in existing plans. This slide just shows the host of different types of plans where this might be done. I do want to call out hazard mitigation plans in particular. They're a great opportunity to consider how green infrastructure can help with resilience. Those plans are updated every 5 years. And a number of FEMA funding sources, including BRIC, as Camille just shared with us, require that projects have a connection to these plans. So if nature-based solutions can be put into these plans when they're updated, then you're ready to make that connection when you're ready to apply. Next slide, please. Finally, just a quick note about how do we pay for this? Just wanted to share some ways that communities are really starting to fund green infrastructure. One is ballot measures. We've seen places on both sides, both coasts, start to have these and set aside money for restoring and protecting natural areas. There are also grants that support green infrastructure. BRIC, we talked about, obviously, and CRF. Those are two of the biggies right now. Another funding possibility is community stormwater fees or taxes based on impervious cover on properties. I live in St. Pete in Florida, and I know that our taxes are based on the amount of impervious, so communities really are implementing this. And then there's innovative financing mechanisms emerging. I'll mention just one, which is pay for performance. That's where investors provide the money up front to implement green infrastructure. A project outcome is established, like reducing erosion or runoff, and then repayment is tied to achieving that outcome. You can use no or low interest loans. We had some dialogue yesterday about the concept of state revolving funds. And then finally, communities are getting creative with incentives, things like stormwater fee discounts, tax credits, and awards and recognition for application of green infrastructure at the site level. Next slide is my last one. I know we'll have discussion at the end and questions, but if you do have any questions about any of the resources that I shared today, things on Digital Coast that we don't get to during discussion, please do feel free to reach out. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Gavin. Thanks.
Hey, great. Thanks, Heidi. Let's go ahead and jump right on into Rod Braun's talk. We're running a little bit long, but I think we can catch up in the back. Okay.
Excellent.
Rod, take it away. Great.
Great. Thanks, Gavin. Appreciate it. Two great presentations, so it's a tough act to follow. So I'm Rod Braun. I manage the Climate and Coastal Resilience Program for the Nature Conservancy in Florida. I've been with the TNC for about 3 years, and I'm based in West Palm Beach. Prior to that, I worked for the South Florida Water Management District, working on Everglades restoration projects, stormwater, and local initiatives. And while there too, I participated. Actually, I was the external affairs officer for the Emergency Operations Center that they ran. So I have a lot of experience with sort of local governments, 16 counties in the South Florida area, and those issues. So today I'm going to be talking about the business case for nature-based solutions, and I think it follows on some of the things that Heidi and Camille were talking about. We can go to the next slide, please. I just wanted to give a little bit about the Nature Conservancy and how we fit it into this space. Essentially, our mission is to protect the lands and waters on which all life depends. So it's sort of a lofty mission, and you can go to the next slide. Seeing a little bit of a lag here. And so just to give you a little bit about who we are, we're really the largest conservation nonprofit in the world. We work in all 50 states and in more than 79 countries, essentially. We have about 600 scientists working on really pragmatic solutions. So we're really science-based in terms of how we make decisions and the projects that we want to move forward on. And as you can see here in that graphic, we're relationship-based. And it's a really critical piece, working with partners, thousands of communities and members to really kind of help move nature-based type projects forward. Go to the next slide. And so we really, to preserve all life and habitats and things like that, we really need to tackle climate change and sort of the causes and really sort of the impacts of climate change. And we really can't do that without working on these issues. And so we're really looking towards a low carbon future. And what I'll be mostly talking about today is really how do we strengthen resilience to the impact of climate change. You can go to the next slide. And so the Nature Conservancy is really working across the globe to increase coastal resilience and climate adaptation. And we're really doing that through restoring natural infrastructure and implementing nature-based projects. And I'm going to give some examples in Florida where I work, and I'm also talking about globally. So I'm going to give you that kind of global to local perspective today. You can go to the next slide. And so some folks, I preceded me talked about natural infrastructure, and I just wanted to kind of give a little bit more of a definition here. And this is something people kind of ask, what is really natural infrastructure? And it can be anything like salt marshes, it can be oyster reefs, it can be our natural systems like even beach dunes, right? And it can be, green infrastructure as well. And Heidi talked about sort of the numerous co-benefits that these things can provide, so I won't really go into that. But you can see here in this graphic that we've done a large body of work on sort of this subject, and it's really about that hazard risk reduction. And you can see with healthy habitats, with good coral reefs, oyster reefs, and even mangroves, it can really decrease storm surge, wave height. And if you look sort of on that bottom piece of the graph, you can see with, degraded coral reefs and mangroves, you're more likely to have increased flooding from storm surge, king tide events, things like that. And so I just wanted to show that graphic. You can go to the next slide. And so we've actually been doing a lot of work even on mangroves too. And you can kind of see this graphic that mangroves really kind of can reduce storm surge quite a bit, really helping ease flooding to land and properties. And it's really interesting in terms of what you have when storm surge occurs. It really kind of stacks up, and you can see that right in front of the mangroves, right? So the storm surge stacks up, it really acts as a barrier, and you have really kind of a decreased flooding on the backside, really protecting homes. And so that's something that at TNC, we're very interested in really quantifying these benefits. We think that's really critical as these solutions become really a go-to. Go to the next slide. And so you can see some of these numbers here. This is some of these are global and some of these are U.S. numbers, but so many people, right? Hundreds of thousands, millions being displaced by climate events globally, and the dollar amounts, with these storms. And you can see, just recently came out in 2020, there were 22 events exceeding sort of that $1 billion event. And that's not even talking about all the economic losses associated with that. That's just sort of direct losses. And so I would sort of argue that, we've really lost a lot of habitat over the years. And so this has really sort of contributed to these sort of increased numbers. We've lost something like 85% of oyster reefs, 50% of mangrove coverage. Our reefs are in serious decline and being threatened today. So I think, because of those systems in such sort of, in a bad state, I think that these numbers have increased over time. And I think we really need to start spending a lot more resources in terms of investing in our natural infrastructure. Go to the next slide. And so talking sort of about that business case. And so, like I said, TNC has spent a lot of time researching with our scientists and other partners to kind of really come up with a business case to look at sort of those avoided losses, right? What could be avoided in terms of with these natural infrastructure components. So we saw that coastal wetlands can reduce more than 625 million in avoided losses during Hurricane Sandy. We know that coral reefs globally prevent 272 billion in flood damages from 100-year storm events. A recent study that came out that we did with the USGS showed 675 million in annual avoided losses just in Florida alone. That's what the coral reef, in terms of the protection it provides. And then mangroves can protect the global economy for more than 80 billion in losses annually. So these are really significant numbers that our natural systems really provide quite a bit in terms of protection. Go to the next slide. All right, bit of a lag. And so I just show you one study here. It's another one that looked at the Gulf Coast study, really interesting, and you can see the citation there. But we looked at sort of the cost effectiveness of different nature-based solutions and really kind of, great infrastructure solutions to really kind of reduce flooding in the Gulf Coast. And they found out that adaptation measures could prevent up to 57 billion in losses over the next 20 years. And nature-based options could actually contribute to more than a third, and here it says about 36% of these costs annualized. So it really have a really significant contribution here in terms of risk reduction. And you can go to the next slide. And this graphic actually shows the sort of that benefit cost ratio, something that Camille talked about quite a bit in her presentation. But you can see here in sort of these brownish tan bars, those are your sort of gray or hardened infrastructure or structural components. And the blue or purple graphics actually show your natural systems. And so if you look at sort of your wetlands, your oyster reef, your barrier island restoration, you can see that your benefit cost ratios are quite high, and they're in the range of over 8 down to something like 2. And so if you look at your other BCRs, things like local levees or home elevations, while those can be very effective, they're also very expensive. And so for every dollar that you put in, you may get less than $1 back in risk reduction, so that we see that natural systems provide sort of a really good return on investment. And so there may be a case here to show that, both of these kind of investments would be necessary to complement each other. Go to the next slide. And this one is just an example of Superstorm Sandy. They found through our studies at TNC that coastal wetlands prevented, like I said, about 625 million in property damage. And you can see here basically where natural systems were still intact, there was essentially a significant reduction in avoided losses. Go to the next slide, please. A study that hits down in Florida that we collaborated with Risk Management Solutions, and RMS actually provides services to some of the really big insurance companies, like reinsurance companies as well. And so we did a study that looked at Hurricane Irma impact and flooding impacts and those losses. And you can see the graphic labeled A in the middle shows the flooding extent from Hurricane Irma. And if you look at graphic B, essentially they removed mangroves for a modeling exercise and showed what the extent of flooding would have been without mangroves. And so you can see it's quite extensive, and it resulted in about a savings of $1.6 billion in avoided losses. So those sort of from a large landscape scale standpoint. You go to the next slide, please. So now I'm going to kind of like drill down a little bit. And so, what do these projects look like? What can they look like on the ground, right? Because when you're talking landscape, it's much more difficult to kind of get your arms around that and kind of those restoration efforts. And so we've had really generous support from the Chubb Charitable Foundation, essentially to help kind of prove up this concept, right? So we're looking more of a site-specific restoration and how do we reduce flooding impacts. And so that's exactly what we set on to do. And we looked at a number of sites in the Miami-Dade area to kind of figure that out. Which sites would provide and conceptual projects would provide those benefits in terms of flood reduction. So the idea is that we do this as sort of a site-specific project with the hopes that we can scale it regionally and even potentially globally. You can go to the next slide. So here's an example of some of the problems at one park in Morningside, and actually I happen to be sitting out here right now. It's a beautiful day, and just, you know, king tide flooding. I think this is becoming a more and more common sight that people have seen. I can go to the next slide. And so we came up with a sort of a conceptual design for what we could do here, and really is looking at sort of a coastal resilience type project. We know this park actually has a lot of issues, whether it's king tide or a hurricane storm surge, and they actually have some flooding issues that sort of come up from sort of the landward side of sort of inadequate drainage capacity. And so this is one concept that we looked at to model and to see what those benefits could be. And it's sort of a small footprint. We know that folks wanted to keep a lot of their real estate at the park, also keep a little bit of their view shed and those things. You can go on the next slide. So we modeled those. We did our storm surge analysis, our wave run up, and you can kind of see here, and that just happens to be a 100-year storm event, what it looked like here. Go to the next slide. And I just wanted to show you kind of the summary results. And so we looked at sort of what those avoided losses would be for different storm events. We looked at a 25-year event, for example, and a 100-year event. We looked at the total cost of the project and what we thought the total benefit would be. And so in this case, it's just that modeled concept. We saw that our sort of benefit cost ratios are in the neighborhood of 1 typically or greater, which is really great to see. And you can see here sort of we did sort of a hybrid green-gray solution. We did a natural solution. And so when you add in sort of your ecosystem benefits, we're as high as a 1.48 or 1.43 in terms of benefit cost ratio. And this really was just, you know, a concept that we looked at, and you could really design for something for a significant storm event. You could actually design this for a 100-year event to actually even further reduce your losses. And so this one was not necessarily designed for a storm event. But it just kind of gives you a feeling, you know, are you headed in the right direction? Go to the next slide. And so here is an example of another project that we're working on. And so this is sort of what we call this Palm Beach Resilient Island, and it's this layered habitat approach. And so components of habitats where you can use oyster reef, seagrass, oyster pods, and mangroves essentially to kind of protect a restored island. And the idea is that we could have a restored island that would be for wading bird nesting habitat. American oyster catcher is actually doing quite well in Palm Beach. It's actually starting to recover there. And by creating this habitat, we can test and we can keep it and maintain it through these protocols, and then we would have a success. So I just wanted to give you a flavor of a couple of projects in terms of what it looks like to kind of build these nature-based projects. Go to the next slide. And then Heidi talked about, you know, how do you fund these projects? And I'll just talk about a market-based approach and something that we feel is pretty innovative. And the idea is natural asset insurance, right? Can you insure a natural asset? And some of you may have heard about sort of the work that we've done just south of Cancun in Mexico, where you can insure a natural asset. In this case, coral reef. And they know that coral reef is really the first line of defense to storm surge and wave action. And so it really breaks down that wave energy, and they find that it protects their beaches. And so the tourism industry really got on board because they realized, you know, healthy reef means healthy tourism, right? So they got on board and they started this fund to help on essentially an insurance policy. And so if there is a hurricane event that comes, and the way it's set up, it's a parametric policy. If there's a trigger like a category 1 or a category 3, whatever you set, there would actually be a set payout. That payout would then come out and be paid very quickly in a matter of days to kind of help out with reef brigades that could go back and restore coral reefs, upright fans, or reattach coral branches. And so they found that a reef that is repaired or triaged in that way can kind of come back more quickly and then provide that protection. And so we just got through an assessment looking at Florida and Hawaii. Could we roll out a similar project? And the report just came out. You can see here, so it's insurance for natural infrastructure. And so there's real opportunities, I think, to fund projects in this way. And it could be expanded to things like mangroves, oyster reefs, salt marshes. And so it just doesn't have to stop with coral reefs. So I think it's a really innovative market-based approach. What we found in Mexico, about 20 insurers actually responded to the RFP for the government policy. So if you have 20 insurers that will come out and want to write a policy, we think that it could work. You can go to the next slide. And so that kind of really concludes the presentation. I just kind of do a recap essentially. And so I think nature-based solutions are really part of this layered approach. And I think you saw that sort of in the first presentation in terms of infrastructure, but nature-based can be a real complement to the other things that are going to take place or be implemented. And really, you know, we look at it as reducing exposure of coastal infrastructure, right, while getting those ecosystem services. And one of the major things I didn't really get into is really preserving existing coastal systems. That's really critical. But the next piece is really optimizing the restoration or enhancement for coastal resilience for risk reduction. We know a lot of restoration projects are taking place, but they can be sort of what we say optimized for that component to really look at risk reduction. And then we know that we could use nature-based solutions combined with gray infrastructure essentially for a hybrid solution. And we see that is probably more common, and especially in our urbanized area where you already have lots of areas built out. Maybe there's some seawalls that exist. So that hybrid approach is one that could really work. And that concludes the presentation. And we'll thank you for the opportunity today.
Great. Thanks, Rod. We'll go ahead and let Danielle come up next.
Great, can you hear me? Are you hearing me?
Yes, you're good.
Excellent, wonderful. Thank you, everyone. My name is Danielle Irwin. I'm very happy to be here with you today to do sort of a deep dive into one particular green infrastructure project that has consumed my life for the past year and a half. And it is in the city of Miami. So the city of Miami owns a waterfront park called Jose Marti Park, and we're going to look at the adaptation project, both the funding of it, but also how the project was scored and ranked under a new system, new to Florida anyway. Next slide, please. So Jose Marti Park is an urban park on the Miami River. It's a tidal river on the east side of the Biscayne Bay. It is also part of the Biscayne Bay Aquatic Preserve. You can see the green space in the center of the screen. Note the sloped shoreline along the green space. That's a decorative block slope that's very low elevation. There's a gazebo in the middle, and as you go closer to the I-95 freeway, you can see the pool and rec center. That's another very low-lying area. So there's already a lot of flooding problems due to both tidal flooding as well as stormwater-based flooding, precipitation-based flooding. So we really have two things that we're trying to balance on this shoreline. At the same time, it services a very low-income, low-elevation community adjacent to it, which is East Little Havana. About 44% of the households in this area are below the poverty level. So this park provides a lot of really important amenities, and the city wants to use it as the sort of the hallmark of the toolkit of approaches for managing the shoreline in the age of king tides and sea level rise. Next slide, please. Here's an example of the king tides just from this was 2019, I believe it was. 2020 was even worse. So we looked at where the worst points of flooding were and compared it with the NOAA intermediate high projections as recommended in the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact and the adopted projections and published projections from their latest 2020 update. So we also looked at what the king tide elevations were. Our target years were to plan for 2030 and 2060 in our adaptation. But given that this is a tidal river that's also a very industrialized river, narrow, filled with lots of shipping traffic and other commercial traffic, we also needed to take into consideration the wake of waves, vessel-based waves with tugs and container ships in such a confined waterway. So that added to the level of assessment for water levels here. Next slide, please. The ultimate plan for this park is to combine, this is what you're seeing now is a landscape architect's rendition of the proposed changes, which could be really summarized into a few different approaches. One is a hybrid living shoreline that addresses the higher wave energy here than you would find on more of a natural passive waterfront, as well as resilient seawalls, higher elevation, and adding some ecosystem services to them. We also wanted to improve public access, both through fixed platforms out over the water, a floating platform low down onto the water so people could really have that connection to the water, as well as a kayak launch that's proposed and a water taxi up by where the pool is. You can see in the graphic a little sketch of the water taxi there. But really important in this were the green infrastructure strategies brought in to manage the stormwater. The stormwater that is currently untreated. There are three big stormwater pipes that go through the park. We're also going to be improving the canopy, adding about 300 trees to the canopy and doing additional landscaping, which you'll see later. Next slide, please. So a lot of the guidelines that we're familiar with are focused on less urban, less confined, less high energy shoreline. So we're really in a hybrid approach here. So we looked to the Northeast. In fact, we looked at the resiliency efforts that were going on after Hurricane Sandy up in the Northeast part of the US. And a group called the Waterfront Alliance, which is a relatively new nonprofit, started in around 2007, if I recall, got together with a bunch of experts in the field of waterfront design and came up with these guidelines called the Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines that are applicable to everything from natural shorelines to highly industrialized or commercial or urbanized shorelines. And it's essentially a rating system, but it's really focusing on building resilience to climate change, ecology, additional ecosystem services, and access to the water, and bringing all of those to a project and giving you strategies to approach them. We decided that a lot of the strategies we were already going to apply here would fit under the program. Next slide, please. So we use this as a guidebook. It is a scoring system very similar to LEED. I'm a LEED accredited professional, have been for more than a decade, so I was able to delve right into this scoring system like climbing into a nice comfy blanket. It's very familiar if you're used to ranking programs or ranking projects in LEED. It's broken into 6 chapters. The chapters are listed there, and within each chapter there's criteria that you can score points on. The project would need to achieve at least 115 out of 215 points possible. Next slide, please. So I'm going to take you through this, this project certification that we're doing. This will be the first project certified in the state of Florida, so we're really excited about applying this system here. There are 2 different routes for certification. We are choosing option 1, which is when you submit your conceptual drawings, go through a preliminary evaluation, and then when you have get feedback on how it would score, and then if there are any tweaks that need to be made, you incorporate those and give your 100% construction documents as the final review. It is a little bit more expensive to do it in 2 broken out steps such as that. I put in a red box there the approach that Jose Marti Park will be taking. Since it is a project size that's roughly $40 million or so, we fall into the $15,000 application fee that the city has just recently approved to be able to submit. So this is a very timely presentation. Next slide, please. So we have a design team in this first category that actually earns us 6 points. On the left-hand side, you can see the little mangrove graphic. That's all the different companies that are part of the design team. I've starred just Curtis and Rogers, the prime on the contract, the landscape architect firm. eSciences is doing all the civil drainage, and Cummins Cedarburg, the firm I am with, is doing all of the coastal and marine engineering along the waterfront. That gives us 6 points right there. We used a matrix that you'll see on the next few slides as we go into the different categories that shows how many points are possible, which ones are we targeting, and then we went through and assigned who was responsible in our team of the 3 stars there on that picture. And then that's where you see the responsible party columns. That's a frame of reference if you're interested. Wanted to explain what was on the screen here though, because the next categories are things like social vulnerability. In the center graphic, you can see the black outline of where Jose Marti Park is, and it is very high in the social vulnerability given its location in East Little Havana. On the right-hand side, we got we're getting additional points just because of the sheer amount of flooding that is already being experienced, as well as in 2060, what it would look like. So if you see the outline in red on the map, you can see that by 2060, there are a few portions of the park, sort of in the central waterfront and in the north waterfront, that are going to be flooded most of the time by 2060. So those are some of the key areas that we looked at. Next screen. Public participation gave us a whole bunch of points also, and there has been so much over the past few years on this in the planning stage as well as the conceptual design, and then the community has remained engaged. Key to the public engagement approach for this was really spreading out the engagement, some during the day, some during the evenings, some on the weekend, providing childcare, providing food, really doing all different types of approaches to get as much feedback as we could. We would target some for professionals, we would target some for the community. So really the way we went about it was meant to try and get as much feedback as possible that would help inform the design. Next slide. So getting into the big 12 points of coastal risk reduction associated with this waterfront, we looked at the existing conditions. And if you recall in the green space where the decorative blocks were sloped up to the shoreline there, the little river walk that they have, on the left side, you can see that the elevation of that curb is only about 2.2. Well, the king tide elevation is already at 2.5 today and just going to get worse in years to come. So that's a really obvious point of flooding there. We knew that was going to be a targeted area. Similarly, on the right by the pool, the low elevation seawall is only at 2.5, and these are NABD. Also king tide elevation today, so we knew that was a point of flooding. So next slide. We decided to use nature-based features wherever we could. We could not on 100% of the shoreline, but on the northern shoreline, this is a cross-section of the hybrid living shoreline. You can see from the water side, you've got a rock revetment that goes up to about mean high water today and king tide elevation 2.5. Mangrove planter, a little step elevation change in the planter up to higher salt marsh, then further on to the seawall, where the seawall elevation, today's cap would be 6 feet, but it would be designed to be adapted to 8 foot by 2060, and then the river walk where the person is standing right next to it. Now, we needed to make sure our plants were appropriate for the elevations that were provided, but we also needed to make sure that we maintained a visual connection with the waterway. So you can see the cone of vision of the individual on the river, the proposed river walk, and he wants to be able to look out and not see just mangroves. He'd like to see the river and the upstream and downstream area as well. So we needed to use that information to really tailor where we would trim mangroves and where we would not, so that we could maintain visual connections. Next slide. So here on the southern planter, our visual concerns were not quite as confining. On the left-hand side, you can see the blue arrows are sight lines of someone walking in the along the river walk, which is defined along the edge with that black dashed line there. And the planter would have mangroves that could grow to full height under the I-95 overpass. Since it's already behind the bridge fender, we didn't have to worry about people being upset about a line of sight out to a bridge fender. They can still see upriver and downriver, and there's plenty of overstory height space for the trees to grow. We expect them to grow maybe 20 feet or so, 20, 25 feet at max height and way down the line. So we got a lot of points for some of these visual connections and other connections such as the fixed and floating boardwalks that I mentioned. And we also looked at, next slide please, I believe is the next slide, community connections. So this brings us into another category where we really had to make sure we were improving people's access to the water. We don't want to build a great park but then have it so fortified that people can't have that nature connection. So we got a number of points from increasing public access and providing high quality public access on the waterfront, as well as passive educational features, Greenway Connections. You see on the left-hand side, the fixed and floating boardwalks that are proposed, In the center slide, you have 2 vantage points, one of the pedestrian riverwalk along the water's edge, but also the little water taxi in the nook in the background there. That will be a new point of water access provided that is not currently provided in the park. On the right-hand side, you're looking down the riverwalk out at the kayak launch. There's history on site that shows it was an active canoe club well before modern times and the modern industrial nature of the waterway. So we wanted to bring some of that historical context out as well. Next slide, please. We had a really great opportunity with the passive educational features here to enhance the learning opportunity of the green infrastructure strategies and the nature-based approaches. On the left-hand side, you see the schematic of the focus area of the park improvements, and each little icon is a different sign that would be posted. Everything from your idle speed, slow speed zone, manatee signs, but also more importantly, the living shoreline educational signs about the manatee, about the river's ecology, the aquatic preserve. We'll even have signage about some of the stormwater improvements that we're putting in there so that people can really have that connection to what we're doing on the land and the expected benefits and why we're doing it in terms of that nearshore environmental benefit. Next slide, please. So moving into edge resilience in category 3, we're going after all the points there, 18 out of 18. And that top one, that 8 points, the biggest bang for the buck there is really understanding the context of these improvements, both green and gray. But the green ones in particular, you need to understand the context, not just in the framework of what elevation and what salinity and water levels are you anticipating, but also what type of solar conditions are there. And on the northern side, where the northern living shoreline is proposed, you can see bright yellow in the spring and summer and a little bit less solar radiation in the fall and winter, but great place for planting, certain types of mangroves. And then as you move south on the shoreline, you can see darker shades in that triangular space there where the I-95 overpass goes over. So we use that to really guide what plant species. We'll be using different mangrove plants there that are more shade tolerant than in the northern living shoreline. Next slide. We also needed to figure out how this working waterfront piece was going to fit into it. So these are cross sections of the water taxi landing, and we were going to get 6 points just for providing some protection of the shoreline strategy in this location. It's going to be a resilient seawall, higher elevation, as well as a deck with pilings that will have a fendering system. And the fendering system and the decking will help protect the longevity of the more gray infrastructure that's part of the shoreline, the seawall. On the right-hand side, you can see where that ferry fits right into those improvements. The fendering system also acts to prevent manatees from getting crushed. Next slide, please. So we're getting some points for enhancing the more gray infrastructure portion of the project, the seawalls, where we needed to maintain that working waterfront edge. And some of these are things like ecological concrete that is good for creating habitat and oyster reef reconstruct or oyster, attracting oysters to recruit and colonize, as well as on the right-hand side, these reef panels that will attach to the wall. Next slide. Lots of points in natural resources. I've already covered most of those in the past few slides. We're doing a whole spectrum from mangrove to coastal hammock across the cross section of the park, from the water to the street. Next slide. I'd like to focus just on the stormwater slides because we have a lot of improvements coming. If you could click the video. Pretty much standard course in Southeast Florida. City of Miami is no different. Our backflow preventers being put in the stormwater pipes, 3 stormwater pipes, as I mentioned, going through here. We're also getting quite a bit of additional pervious space through the use of the pave drain paver system, which is depicted in the picture there. And a lot of this will be incorporated into the waterfront designs, such as the northern living shoreline, which is shown on the left. Next slide. The biggest, again, bang for the buck, not to be redundant, but really came from the baffle boxes. And on the next slide, you can see the graphic of the baffle boxes that will be plopped into the, in line with the 3, with the 3 stormwater pipes that are coming. These baffle boxes will have a window on the ground that you can look in and see them capturing plant debris and other litter, and it's going to reduce the total nitrogen, total phosphorus, and total suspended solids quite a bit running off of this park. The waterway is impaired for coliform bacteria, so one of our permitting agencies asked us to put dog waste stations in, dog waste collection points in along the river. So we're using that as well as part of our water quality improvement points. Next slide. Wrapping up here, innovation. We're getting a number of different points for innovation from both the material standpoint, piloting a number of different types of material, but also from the perspective of exemplary performance. We decided to go after the points that we were going to omit because we're looking at the carbon footprint of our strategies versus traditional strategies. And we think that applying that to this project will help us gain those points. And we will be using some of the resources that both Heidi and Ron have talked about today already. So I encourage you to learn more about it, get your WEDGE accreditation. There are training programs that are being offered throughout the year. The next slide summarizes the funding. This project decided not to pursue BRIC funding, but instead pursued a couple of different others, got awarded Florida Inland Navigation District funding, funding from the Florida Department of Economic Opportunity through their Rebuild Florida General Infrastructure Program grant. That's the big boy, $15.3 million. Florida Forever Bond, and then because of the best benefit to cost ratio and some other concerns about whether or not the project would address 100% of the flooding, the city decided not to pursue BRIC funding. So thank you for your attention and for letting me talk with you about the project. And if you'd like to learn more, next slide, there's my information.
Great, thanks Danielle. I know we're running a little long, but Andy, Andy's our last speaker. We're not going to shorten Andy's talk, so you've got your 15 minutes. But what we're doing is we're going to condense the discussion, and I'll talk about that once Andy wraps up. Great, thank you.
Thank you, Gavin. And so in my presentation, I'll be talking about work that we've been conducting through the Coastal Dynamics Design Lab. We're a community engagement technical assistance group that runs out of the North Carolina State University College of Design, where I'm a colleague of Gavin's. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to move really quickly through the slides. I'm not going to go into the content of the slides because the slides are meant to really outline a process, give you a sense of how we're helping communities in the rural context, small, historically underserved communities in North Carolina, towards applying toward in this first round of BRIC applications. Next slide. So in North Carolina, if you're not familiar with some of the recent events, Hurricane Matthew and Hurricane Florence were incredibly devastating through floodwaters and more inland than a coastal event. So very much riverine flooding events, and then also Hurricane Dorian most recently creating damage. Next slide. In our case, it's thinking about the scale of intervention from the very large regional, bioregional, these massive flooding events, all the way down to a smaller scale of true recovery. Next slide. And so for a little bit of context, if you're not familiar with North Carolina, the shaded area here is the coastal plain of North Carolina, the physiographic region. And you can see just by landmass as a comparison, just the eastern part of North Carolina that's either inner or outer coastal plain designation is the size equivalent of 11 states of Delaware. And so I know many people on the call are probably from very large states with big issues too. So this is a little bit what we're working on. And 27% of this land area resides within the 100 or 500 year FEMA map floodplain. And so you're talking about, a lot of impact that's come from these recent storm events and historical storm events too, of course, but looking more in the contemporary context of what we've been dealing with. These purple areas intersect some of the most economically distressed communities and counties, not just in North Carolina, but in the nation. In many ways, we refer to this area as America's second Delta. Next slide. And so thinking again about scale is that recovery is granular. It happens at the level of the individual and the home site and the homeowner. And so that's where we've focused our work, is working within communities for the benefit of the community, but also understanding that it has to work within the policy framework and also the realities of these survivors. Next slide. So I'm going to be walking through what we call the floodprint process. It is a way of, it's a bespoke process in which we go into different communities and we work specifically around their needs. These are not necessarily, we're not talking about coastline communities here in the Atlantic sense. We're talking about shoreline communities, riverine communities in the coastal plain of North Carolina. Next slide. So we are looking through a conservation and a recreation lens. And so this idea of, you know, you've got these very large events. How do we start to find opportunities for communities to not only mitigate these circumstances, but also moving from just surviving into kind of a thriving mode related to the realities of being a small rural community, and recreation, conservation, and all the things that come with the amazing Eastern North Carolina landscape are the elements that we're focusing on. So turning perceived threats and then reconnecting places with their water in a way that they understand that those are assets treated carefully. Next slide. So looking at the realities of checkerboarding and other kinds of patterns of discontinuity that come from acquisition or buyout programs. So looking across those patterns in different communities. And then in the case of Lumberton, North Carolina, which this document's about, or this series of documents, we are working with decision makers and town staff on areas most heavily impacted within the town boundary. So all the area that you see in the faded kind of blue color, the cyan, that's the flood extents of Hurricane Matthew and basically Hurricane Florence as well. And so we started looking at these 4 areas, again, that the community identified as the greatest need. Next slide. And so back to recreation, thinking about natural infrastructure and that connectivity of creating a kind of amenitized green infrastructure network. We were able to connect a loop. We call it the Lumberton Loop, that represents an 8.5-mile greenway. It connects 108 properties, over 806 acres of green space, 99% of which is in the 100-year floodplain. And we can do that through geospatial work using the acquisition of 9 strategic parcels. So it only takes 9 parcels through acquisition to be able to connect this massive piece of community infrastructure. Next slide. We conduct analysis such as gap analysis, where we look at which parts of the community are being served by green space and access to nature. Next slide. Also, we conduct robust vulnerability analyses. Here you see a composite, and I'm going to take you through a series of slides that just kind of shows you a snapshot of what goes into a really robust vulnerability assessment. This is the composite, and I'll show you some of the fields that we were looking at. Next slide. So first, we were looking at the ecological vulnerabilities. So all kinds of spatial considerations about adjacencies and to floodplain, to park areas, open green space, conservation on land, etc. Next slide. Also looking at what the vacancy already is in terms of no tree cover or really good tree cover, buildings, no buildings, vacant parcels, publicly owned versus private. These are all the realities in terms of actually managing land in a community. Next slide. And then also social vulnerability factors. There's, within most communities, you're going to find those populations that are low wealth or historically marginalized, groups of color. In Lumberton, there's also indigenous population, the Lumbee tribe. This is their ancestral lands. And so making sure that we're trying to be as inclusive and representative as possible, because I'm sure, as you all know, the most vulnerable folks tend to live in the most vulnerable areas. Next slide. And then visualizing those changes over time. And so actually being able to look parcel by parcel at who is applying into acquisition programs in buyout, but then also using these to talk to community members about the potential if they were to enter into a buyout program, how their property would serve the greater community. And actually we found that a lot of folks who didn't originally sign up for consideration in the buyout program, post Matthew and post Florence, after we started working in this way in which we could visualize the change and visualize the steps, a lot of folks actually came to the table and said they were really interested in entering into the program. Next slide. We look at the funding mechanisms, so the CIPs for the communities, understanding that any green space that becomes vacant is going to become a financial burden or financial responsibility of the community. So looking through different data points and working with NRPA data to be able to again acknowledge the amount of green space that's coming into an already low capacity community. Next slide. Talking about additional considerations, offering up community engagement plans that relate to future work. Next slide. Talking about regional networks of how to leverage partnerships, funding opportunities. So in Lumberton is almost in the center of the Lumber River State Park, which is actually also a national scenic river. And so being able to connect into the resources that the state park system has, and also this becomes what we're proposing as an urban hub or a kind of a semi-urban hub to this park system, so that there's an in-town location to access the river, in which currently there is not a good place to do that. Next slide. And then phase 2 is we've been working in Lumberton for almost between 3 and 4 years on this project. Next slide. So again, trying to connect the checkerboard. We all know how difficult checkerboarding is in communities in terms of turning that land into something usable. And so we're working proactively on that. And that's where this connects to the current BRIC applications. Next slide. Back to the Lumberton Loop, just to give you context, the Meadow Branch in the yellow to the upper side of the map, and then Scottish Packing to the lower. Those are the 2 focus areas that we've been working most with those neighborhoods. Next slide. And just some of the scope of work. So what you'll see, and again, these are spreads from the documents themselves. So I don't intend for you to read these pages, but I want to show you how we document things. So these are excerpts from the reports. But with this work, we've been able to get other grants. So just in this neighborhood, we've had 12 property owners sign up that weren't previously signed up for acquisition through the engagement. Almost 10 acres have been donated already into conservation programs, $150,000 in environmental enhancement grant, plus this is part of the current BRIC application going in this week. Next slide. And so we do a lot of modeling and scenario planning. The next few slides look for this teal to turn yellow. And this is about actually going into a nature-based infrastructure strategy of restoration. The teal is the floodable area, and the yellow is the area no longer flooded through nature-based applications. So next slide. Next slide. Next slide. And then we also start looking at those cross sections, bridge crossings, other hardened infrastructure assets, and talk about how those need to be elevated, potentially removed as part of this nature-based infrastructure. Next slide. Next slide. So those are just, again, quick snapshots of scenarios of how we're working with different groups. That's with Public Works that we're developing that, and we're working with a great team of hydraulic and hydrologic modelers from NC State. We also conduct community outreach. Next slide. So this is in that same Meadow Branch neighborhood. We conduct listening sessions in which we try to understand the issues. Again, these folks are survivors, and a lot of trauma post-storm, and we're in there talking about some future vision of this this Lumberton loop. But what we found is our analyses on each parcel really makes a difference to these folks, because they don't understand what their neighbors are doing or the larger decisions that are potentially at play with the community. So these types of interactions are really, really key to informing people and also getting them to understand their options as they try to put their life back together. Next slide. 2, we run through scenarios and design workshops to be able to get community voting, understand how we can amenitize in the best way to serve the neighborhood, and maintenance considerations. Next slide. And then working with city council and city staff, actually both phases of the floodprint in Lumberton, and also Princeville is another community we're working with. These have been adopted plans, and so these are tied to other resilience plans, hazard mitigation plans, but these are kind of the on the ground actionable steps that the community is going to take to get to those broader goals that are in those mitigation plans. Next slide. And so again, block by block showing the transition. So we'll flip through these quick. Next slide. The yellow are HMGP Matthew, and then we also have another round of these that's HMGP Florence. So this is the change over time, developing short and long-term scenarios. Next slide. Next slide. And even looking at tax base and how this works. And so with that, and to look at the time, just again, that's kind of a recap, and that's one neighborhood that we looked at here in Lumberton. But with that, I want to make sure that there's some time for discussion. So thank you for allowing me to share a little bit.
Great, thanks, Andy. And we are running a little long, and that's okay. I think those are all great presentations. And what I'd like to do is ask all of the panelists just to show yourself with your cameras. And what I'd like to do is just have a conversation. And what I would ask is just in a way to speed this up is for those of you on the list, if you would just kind of raise your hand, and I will kind of call on you, and we can just have a discussion for the remainder of the time. So if anybody wants to start, I think Danielle may have had an initial comment. Danielle, would you like to share your comment or question to Camille?
Sure, thank you. Well, it turns out that I did not think my project applied for BRIC funding, and in fact, it was considering it. When I prepared the slide, they said that they had applied for it, and then just last night I heard, oh, it turns out at the last minute we decided not to because of the cost-benefit analysis being over 1, and the perception that the grant evaluator at the city had that the project would have to address 100% of the flooding. And on the Miami River, I mean, there's so much flood zone north of us, south of us, opposite us, and behind us that there's no way our project could have solved 100% of the flood risk, certainly not in 2030 and 2060. So I wasn't sure if you might want to offer some points of clarification on that, Camille.
Sure. Excuse me. Sure. I sit quietly for an hour, my voice goes. So a couple things, and let me start with, I am not a benefit cost analysis expert. I talk about it a lot because it is a key component of our program. Luckily, we have an entire team in the division I work in that this is their full-time job, is working creating the benefit cost analysis, doing updates to it, doing improvements to it. They are constantly looking for ways to do better. As you're talking about 100% flood reduction, no, I don't ever expect to really quite honestly see that in any kind of a drainage project. Mitigation is about reduction, elimination. Would we like to reduce flood damages at 100%? Absolutely. Is that reality? No. Acquisition projects like Dr. Fox is talking about, absolutely, that with the buyout, you have 100% reduction because you've removed the property from the flood hazard. But as you look at the stormwater projects and other utility projects, stormwater, other drainage projects, things like that, you're never going to be able to achieve a cost effectiveness. It's just going to be too expensive to completely remove the flood burden. So we look at, but you should be reducing it. And so basically the way our module works is what our benefit cost analysis experts would tell me, is you look at what the floodings are before the mitigation, and then you look at, by putting those measures in, what reductions did you achieve? So how much damages are you still having after the mitigation? So at some point you're going to hit a trigger where you're going to start incurring those damages again, but how much was it reduced through the process? And does that, you know, do you get a savings of $1 to $1 federal dollar through that? Hopefully that was helpful.
Great. Other questions from the panel? Just a show of hands. If not, I can ask one, but I'd rather you all ask them. Yep. Go ahead, Andy. I think Andy may have shot up first, but I'll get you, Rod, in just a second. Yep.
Camille, it's great to hear you talk about the program. It really is, in terms of the vision of it and the values behind it. We just got our revisions in yesterday, and one of the things that we actually had kind of unsolicited from one of the town officials was an email to the benefit cost analysis consultant. And he said in his email, you know, there's no way without this group from NC State basically writing the grant and kind of running some, you know, the analyses on this, that we could do this as a small rural community in competition with larger, you know, urban places that have a lot of resources. You talked a little bit about the assistance that FEMA is able to put behind that, but at only 10 communities. So I'm just curious how you all are thinking about those differences between communities that have resources and wealth and those that have real capacity challenges, and kind of rising to the level that the BRIC is asking in terms of application steps.
Thank you. Yes, there's a couple of different ways I want to talk about that. The first one is, we have some different, in the time allowed today, I cannot go through all the mechanics of the BRIC program. We have some different points in it that will offer some assistance to communities financially that don't have a full design yet, don't have the benefit cost completed yet. A lot of our projects, they're complex. But doing a benefit cost analysis is not easy. The engineering is not cheap. So there are a couple different things. One is, I talked about real briefly capacity and capability building projects. One of those project types is project scoping. It is eligible under the allocation. So that $600,000 that was available this year, we are looking at what that amount will be for next year. So not known yet, but this year it was $600,000. States and tribes and territories can put forward, as part of that $600,000, project scoping applications. And this is for communities that they know they have an issue, but they don't know yet what to do about it, and they don't have the funding to do the engineering work. And so it is seed money to actually build an application for future cycles of funding, whether that go into BRIC or another grant program. It doesn't have to come into BRIC. We'll give you points for it if it comes back to BRIC, but in competition in future years. A second thing we put in the program is something we have in the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which is the ability to phase projects. So this is for a project that is going to go into the competition, and maybe it has conceptual design, it has a preliminary benefit cost analysis, but it didn't have the funding to carry forward to final design. And so what it is you can submit the project as a total to the BRIC program. If chosen, we will fund the phase 1 costs to complete the benefit cost analysis, make it final based on final design, get the environmental permitting taken care of, all those type of expenses. And if still cost effective, if still technically feasible, if still achieving the goals and the deliverables of the project, we would then forward the phase 2 construction funding. So that's another element of the program. We also have that non-financial direct technical assistance I discussed before. On the flip side of how we, that is something that I care a lot about as a person who comes from a small community of 900 in Western Kentucky. And I've had a lot of conversations with people about, oh, but BRIC is just for the urban areas. It's not for rural. It's not, and questions certainly now about, well, how are you focusing on underserved and vulnerable populations? I can tell you that there's a few things we put in the program for this first year to help try to level the playing field. One is, I didn't talk about cost share at all in my talk. So BRIC is a 75% federal, 25% non-federal cost share program. We have one ability to change that, and that is we can give a 90% federal cost share, 10% non-federal for small and impoverished communities. That is defined by legislation of communities that have a population of 3,000 or less, are rural, and are economically disadvantaged. So we have an opportunity in the program for an increased federal cost share for those communities. In addition, as we looked at our competition criteria, we wanted to make sure that we put points in that would help level the playing field for more rural or small areas. So you're going to see in the technical criteria, if you are designated a small and impoverished community, there's points awarded for you for that to help create some balance. As you look at those qualitative criteria, you're going to see as we have one about populations impacted, we're not looking at the overall like number of people, we're looking at percentage of the community. So that way you may not have as much coverage there as far as numbers, but you may be protecting a bigger section of your community. There's also in there a talk about how have you identified different populations that will benefit or not benefit from the project, and how are you dealing with that? In the same way, we have points in there. I appreciate your presentation that you talked about the outreach, and that's one of our criteria is how are you outreaching to the entire community? You're making sure that you are being representative in your design and your implementation. I will say as it deals with equity and the underserved populations, this is something I get really encouraged, and one of the reasons I took this job is when I was told we would be a program that would continuously improve. This is something that is creating equitable outcomes. It is center in our program improvement process. We have active research going on now to make sure, like to examine by independent our different mechanisms in our program, and where can we change those to create more equitable outcomes, or where do we have issue. We are looking right now at year 2 design. Where can we make incremental steps while we do more research? What I've told the team that I have, or the staff that I have that is working on equity concerns, is this is something that I see as very iterative, that we want to make sure that it's in our focus through our year-to-year design in improving over time, that it's not something I think we can, tomorrow it's all going to be good and we're going to have it 100% right. I think it's going to take years to get there, but I want us making those steps every year.
Yeah, great, Heidi, or great, Camille. I'm going to, a couple things. One is maybe you and I and Andy can catch up. I've got some ideas as to how we might look at grasping with some of these issues, just try to perhaps provide some support to you. We could talk about that later, but I wanted to get to Rod, and what I'd suggest is the moderator's prerogative is to let Rod ask his question and then perhaps provide a succinct answer, and then give Heidi a shot to ask a question. We may run a few minutes over. I hope that will work, and that's okay for folks. But let's, Rod, why don't you ask your question, please? Thanks.
Great. Yeah, thank you. So I just recently saw an article in the New York Times. It was a couple of days ago, and it said something like the U.S. strategy would quickly free billions in climate funds, and it kind of called out Fema and BRIC program of several, or I don't know, it was 3 or 4 billion potentially coming. And so any thoughts on how quickly that would be implemented and how local governments will be able to take advantage of that? And it sounds exciting. So I don't know if you had any information on that.
We are very excited. I can tell you that was the way our funding mechanism works is we get our funding as a 6% of post-disaster funding. So when FEMA goes out and does for presidentially declared disasters, they start putting out funding and making estimates. 180 days after that declaration, we are able to get 6% of the estimates across different sections. Last year, we had unprecedented that we had 56 active disasters all at one time for COVID response. 180 days after that started about September through October. And with some of the additional funding that was passed, that ballooned to potentially we could take up to, so the language is up to 6%, $3.7 billion. We currently took $500 million. We were able to put that into the first year of the program and get a little bit in reserve for starting to build the bank for year 2. We are looking at, because one of the things also is we can't take it all, in fairness, all this money lives in something called the Disaster Relief Fund. It's the big pot of money that also pays for those disasters. And one of our rules is we cannot take away, or we cannot bring down the funding for delivery of the recovery programs. So we are looking right now at how we can access those funds and potentially over time take out of those funds, and whether it is an all or nothing every year, or if we can create a reserve so that we could potentially have a stable source of funding for several years and be able to project in future years when we're going to have a bigger funding year. One of the things I very much care about is the capacity and capability of all of our partners to be able to use the funding. I care about I want people to be prepared for a large funding source coming forward. It is not easy to ramp up. Last thing I'd want to do is put money out and we can't use it. So that is something we are actively working, I promise you right now, in how that potential stabilization would happen.
Great, thanks, Camille. So we are at time, but I thought, Heidi, if you'll maybe have our final question, and we'll wrap it up after that.
Sure, thanks, Gavin. I appreciate the opportunity. Sure. And this is for Camille, but others may have thoughts too. As we heard from Andy, one of the big hurdles, and Danielle too, is that cost benefit analysis. And sometimes it's meeting the threshold, but other times it's just the capacity to do it, right? And get through the technical process. And that's something that my shop is trying to think about. What tools can we provide to help people with that piece? But I wondered about examples as BRIC gets going, and Camille, I think you'll get some good applications this year that do make it for nature-based solutions. And I'm wondering about if y'all have thought about how to share those and help people see sort of the possibilities there.
Yeah, and I do want to open it up to others because I've shared some of the financial resources BRIC has, but I think a lot of it is through partner too, of how other organizations can help communities actually do those technical pieces. As far as sharing, yes, that is the Mitigation Action Portfolio map. That is where I see as our first place. Right now it's got 42 case studies, none of them are BRIC funded. As we fund projects, and I want to make sure they, as they start getting implemented, how are we being able to showcase those? We also, and this is going to be over the next few years, we develop this. You'll see a nod to it in our 2020 NOFO, or Notice of Funding Opportunity, that went out. We're looking at how we can do case studies for effectiveness as well, which is a separate effort that we've got going on, because we have some big tasks to do to show that the BRIC program is effective in reducing damages across the country. So that's a couple of different mechanisms we're hoping to share. Also, with doing web, we anticipate doing another summer series next summer where we'll talk about some of the things we saw in lead up to year 2, and we'll start showcasing through our communications that way too.
Great. Thanks, Camille. Again, I know we're at time. Are there any other pressing issues or comments that folks want to make before we sign up? I think it's been a fantastic panel, but I just didn't know if there were any final words from anyone that they wanted to share.
Just really quickly, I think Heidi's question is great, and I think helping build the network that can provide these tools. One thing that we're doing in this BRIC application for Lumberton around the loop is connecting it to other factors beyond ecosystem services, the nature-based and ecological metrics, and the flood risk reduction, is also community health, is connecting it to, again, access to green space and open space more from the social side. And so I think that's one aspect that we got feedback in our revisions from the BCA consultant, is that they said you're pushing the limits of the tool with some of these. And when we look at like travel cost method and other things about how do you get to parks and park prescriptions, but they said keep it in there because these are the things that can flag it to make the system better as it adapts. But I would say that's one element, maybe NRPA, American Society of Landscape Architects, others who are working on other performative measures, that there's, bringing people to nature has a cost or a benefit as well. There's a cost to doing nothing, and there's tremendous upside, as we know, to community health and individual health related to that access. So I would say if that can be folded into the physical science, is the social and kind of humanities side, that starts to, I think, paint the bigger picture and the impact here of working with nature in our communities, and not guarding against it or not thinking it's limited in its benefits.
Thanks, Andy. And Camille, if you had a final comment to that, or if I'll leave you with the last word if you no. Okay. Well, again, I just want to thank all the panelists. They're super. I think it's a wealth of information. It was a fantastic panel, and I appreciate your time, and certainly those that attended got as much out of it as I did. So again, thank you so much, and we'll see many of you on a future panel.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care, everyone.
Great. Thank you.